pleasure is to introduce Guillaume Bidault to you. I'm very happy that Guillaume found time to share his thoughts with us. I'm sure that we will have a very interesting paper and then an interesting questions. Guillaume Bidault studied history at Université Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and then he continued with an MA in history at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He also studied with the famous Paolo Odorico, one of our fellow Byzantinists. And afterwards, he achieved a graduate diploma in history and Greek studies at the École Normale Supérieure of Paris. At the moment, he's writing his PhD at the Sorbonne, and his PhD project title is Pastoral Communities, Spaces and Powers in the Southern Balkans, Macedonia, Epirus and Thessaly from the 10th to the 15th century. And at the moment, he's working on various sources, reading and evaluating them. So he will speak today to us on mapping mobility, constructing community, considerations on the definition, representation, and speciality of pastoral communities in the Byzantine and early Ottoman Balkans. In the end, at the end of the paper, we will have, of course, questions. And now, Guillaume, we are very much looking forward to your paper. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would first want to apologize for making this presentation in English, which is more comfortable for me and probably more understandable for you than my German. So I'm very happy to share my work with you today. And thank you all very much for attending this online lecture. I would like to warmly thank Mihailo Popovic, my PhD supervisor, for kindly inviting me to present my current research and thoughts in this digital HistGeo lecture series. So I would like to preface this presentation with a few quotes indicative of what I see as the paradoxical situation of pastoral communities in the medieval Balkans. So the first quote comes from John Kantakouzenos' history. So I'll read it in Greek. So, Olio de parethonos χρόνων, ingeleto εκ esperas paraton επιτροπευόντων εκεί, ότι υπέρι βαλάρητα και κάνουν ημώνοι Αλβανοί, εχερίς όντες προς μεταβολάς και φύση νεωτεροποιεί, ας προς βασιλεία επίγησαν συνθήκες παραβαίνοντας, τες εκεί σε πόλησιν εξ εφόδου επίοντες, κακώς διατηθέαση και λαιλατούσιν. Well, please tell me if translation is needed. But what I find very interesting in this quotation is that John Kantakouzenos, who describes a bit earlier the Albanians as mobile pastoralists, presents them as naturally insubordinate and lawless, in a way very reminiscent of Herodotus's account of the Scythians. And they were presented as being on the margins of Byzantine political order and civilization. So this represents one view of pastoral communities in the Balkans, from the point of view, of course, of literate elites as being barbarians from the inside. Now, this second quotation, which comes from a historical narrative of the history of Mount Athos in the 12th century, reads, Ide adiorite memnide ton vlachon, osa keia tis idonis i sinithia, ta tirata ke ta tiria ke ta malia, ta simbosia ke sinalarnata, ke ta sframatias tas pros alilus, i vlachi lebo, meta ton nachon, tas metisias, ta trivolikas, etnes efansan en isteron. And so in this quote, there is also an ambiguous vision of the Vlachs, another pastoral community, and but it underlines the very close relations that the monks of Mount Athos maintained with a community of Vlachs which had settled on the mountain. These Vlachs provided, as the quote indicates, cheese, milk, wool, and other services whose nature is not specified. But this indicates a very close social and economic intertwining of these two groups. And more generally of mobile pastoral and other communities, sedentary communities, urban communities, and monastic communities in the Balkans. The last quotation comes from an order issued by Andronikos I Komnenos in 1884. Υπερμνήσθη η βασιλεία μου παρά του μέρους της εν το αθώωρης βασμίας μονής του Αγίου Αθανασίου, ότι οι εν της Μολένης οικούντες κόμμανοι, ανερχόμενοι στην διαφέρουσαν τύπα αυτούς μονή πλανινάν, την ούτω καλούμενην που ζούχια και μαντριά της ζώης, αυτών εξυπηούντες και νεμόντες ταύτα ανέτος, που πείθονται καταβάλουν προς αυτήν των ανήκων υπερδεκατίας των ζώων αυτών. So in this order, the emperor echoes the violations committed by a group of Cuman pastoralists who, as revealed by other documents, are also recipients of imperial incomes, of pronia, reported by the monastery of Lavra. And so in spite of this violation, we can see here that pastoralism was very closely regulated and by the state, since we can see here that pastures could have owners, that cattle folds, that is the mandria of this text, were also regulated, and that the users of pasture lands owed grazing rights to their owner. So we can see here that this, in spite of this, the first quote, pastoralism was very much regulated and had its place within the wider economic and political framework of the Balkans. So I would like to insist that these three examples showcase this ambiguous situation and representation of mobile pastoralists, since they are both on the margins of central authority or presented as such, yet subject to its power, taxes and regulations. They're both distinct from the settled agriculturalist majority, yet constantly interacting with it, both peacefully and sometimes through conflict. So it is this ambiguity that I would like to explore with you today. So to do so, I will divide my presentation in three parts. So the first will be a general presentation of my PhD work, its goals and methodological basis. The second part will include a discussion of some preliminary results. And the third will be comprised of a methodological discussion of two key problems, namely how to build useful analytical categories, how to go past the apparent obviousness of the names and categories we see in the sources to seize this very malleable and apparently elusive subject matter, and also how to properly analyze and represent these study groups in their spatial context. So the main goal of my PhD project, supervised by Mihailo Popovic and Sophie Métivier in Paris, is to provide a comprehensive picture of the pastoralist groups of Macedonia, Thessaly, and Epirus from around 900 to around 1500, in regards to their use of space, their social economic organization and activities, and their interactions with different scales of political authority, from the local to the regional and finally the imperial scale. So although pastoralism and pastoral actors are quite present in modern narratives of the Balkans, for instance, in sources and texts of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, they remain highly elusive in medieval documents, although not absent. As we have seen, these populations are generally perceived, both in contemporary writings and in medieval texts, as peripheral and other, different by the urban, monastic, and literate elites that left written documents. In spite of this, some documents, such as the administrative documents that we saw, show how deeply embedded they are in the economic and political fabric of the medieval Balkans. So it is first necessary to define what I mean by pastoral communities. As I see it, and as visible in the sources, on which I'll touch later, there are three main types of pastoralism in the medieval Balkans, and in fact also in the modern Balkans. On the first hand, there are individual cattle heads, small flocks of a few animals, a few cows, a few sheep, etc., owned by peasant families whose main activity is agriculture in the context of domestic production and consumption. So this is the most widespread type of animal husbandry, of pastoralism. On the other hand, there are also large flocks of tens, hundreds, or even thousands of heads owned by absentee owners who do not live where these flocks are maintained. These comprise wealthy landowners, aristocratic landowners, members of the imperial family or of royal families, urban dwellers, wealthy urban dwellers, or religious institutions, such as monasteries, such as Islamic endowments, sacred endowments, such as Vakf. And these large flocks are aimed at commercial use. And finally, we find flocks owned by usually mobile households or groups in the context of a specialized pastoralist community, which are the topic of this talk and of my PhD. So pastoral communities can be characterized as self-recognized groups, that is a group which recognizes itself as a group, as a community, whose livelihood and social structure is based on the practice of pastoralism, which means that the community, in a whole or in part, may participate in other economic activities, such as agriculture, manufacturing, trading, raids, etc. But pastoralism must be the dominant form of production, the one either that concerns the largest group of individuals, or which forms the basis of wealth or of social organization. Thus, pastoral communities must be distinguished from individual farmers with cattle, so the first category, or professional shepherds living in an otherwise mostly agricultural community, which means that even professional shepherds living in a village will not be counted as a pastoral community. So this distinction is very important. And it should also be noted that pastoral communities must be distinguished from mobile communities. Indeed, many pastoral communities do seem to have a highly mobile way of life, structured by the seasonal movement from one pasture to the next, especially from summer to winter pasture and back. But this cannot be assumed to be the case for all communities or for all periods under consideration, since we will see that transhumance, that is seasonal mobile pastoralism, does not seem to have always existed in at least parts of Macedonia, Thessaly, and Epirus. So one of the aims of this project is precisely to examine when, where, and under what circumstances seasonal mobility emerged and became a defining aspect of pastoral communities. So based on these criteria, groups, as named in the sources, which can often be categorized as pastoral communities, include, so I will use what we could qualify as ethnic names, since that is what the sources give us, but we will see later that this is very ambiguous and should be examined further. So pastoral communities of the medieval Balkans included vlachs, steppe groups, or groups originally from the Pontic steppe, such as Pechenegs and Cumans, at least some populations of Albanians, and pastoral populations of Turkic language originally from Anatolia, such as Yörüks or Turkmens, which were settled in the Balkans starting in the Ottoman period. So some Greek-speaking and Slavic-speaking populations did participate in pastoralism, as we have seen at the village level, the family level, but the sources make it very hard to qualify them as specialized pastoralists, especially for Greek-speaking groups. We know from more modern examples that there were groups of Greek-speaking mobile pastoralists, such as the Sarakatsani, but it is very hard to trace in the medieval period, at least in the region considered. So why exactly is it interesting to study these groups in particular compared to the other two categories of pastoral actors, pastoral users? So firstly, they form a highly diverse group since, as we saw, they may come from many different ethnic groups, places, and periods. And they often differ both in economic and linguistic terms from the majority population they interact with, namely Slavic populations and Greek-speaking populations. And this begs several questions. How do permanently settled agricultural or mostly agricultural communities interact with pastoral communities? How clearly can these two groups be delineated, be distinguished? And further, how do pre-modern Balkan states, political entities, exert authority over mobile or non-agricultural groups, since the main framework of power relies on the control and taxation of agricultural groups. So furthermore, pastoral communities are often, but not always, concentrated in areas where state authority, where imperial authority is usually considered to be relatively weak, at least in conventional historiography, in areas such as mountains, most notably. Studying these communities can therefore be a way to better understand how pre-modern Balkan political entities exerted authority over what we could term peripheral spaces, at least from the perspective of these political centers, such as highland areas. And so we could see two main hypotheses, two main ideas that might not be true, but which may guide our analysis. Either these groups could be integral parts of the Bulgarian, Byzantine, Serbian, Ottoman political systems, or they may be seen as deliberately living on the edge of these state systems. And we could ask perhaps if these populations deliberately sought to remove themselves from state societies, following the model elaborated by James C. Scott for upland Southeast Asia with his concept of zoning. Of course, the truth is likely in the middle, but these are two extremes that we might compare. Finally, mobile, specialized pastoral communities do seem to be a specificity of the medieval Balkans compared to other areas of the wider European space, with the exception, of course, of the Pontic steppe and the Pannonian basin. The Balkans, pastoral communities, specialized pastoral communities, do seem to have a higher presence, a higher cohesion in the highland areas of the Balkans, such as the Dinaric Alps, the Pindus Mountains, the Stara Planina, compared to other mountain areas of Europe, such as the Alps, or perhaps the Pyrenees. So we may ask why this phenomenon seems more widespread in the Balkans compared to other areas which might share, at first glance, a similar situation, at least geographical situation. So how do we explain this divergence? And what is the nature and the extent of this specificity? Were the Balkans always marked by pastoral, specialized pastoralism throughout this whole period? Or is it something that starts at some point, for instance, in the Middle Byzantine period, or does it become more intense in the Ottoman period? So to tackle these questions, This project relies on several hypotheses, which will be confronted with the sources. So my first hypothesis is that specialized pastoralism is a sign of social, economic, and political complexity, which means that it requires structural interconnections and differentiation of complementary economic groups. That is, it requires regular and reliable trade, social differentiation, institutional stability, and some form of freedom of movement. Furthermore, pastoralism is highly responsive, not responsible, but responsive to political and economic changes and to the institutional framework. So I think that it is not a ahistorical phenomenon, but something that very much reacts and evolves in concert with other trends in demography, in trade patterns, in political institutions. Since, as we will see, transhumance in a recognizable form only seems to emerge after the 10th century in the area under review, which means that the pastoral communities studied and their economic strategies and relations with settled powers, political powers, vary significantly over the course of time. And finally, one hypothesis that I deem very important is that interactions with states and political institutions, more generally, are key to the definition and construction of these groups, their organization and economic practices. So my hypothesis is that these ethnic labels are actually politically constructed by these central administrations, co-constructed with these groups in order to create a legible structure, in order to organize these highland areas. So this, I'm testing these hypotheses within the geographical scope of Macedonia, Thessaly, and Epirus. So the northern half of Greece on this map and northern Macedonia, or as it is written in this map, Macedonia. So they can be considered as one unit from the point of view of pastoralism, based on a very strong degree of mobility from one region to the other. Indeed, the Pindus Mountains, which run through northern Greece and Albania and northern Macedonia, shared by these three regions, is one of the historic cores of mobile pastoralism in the Balkans, alongside the Stara Planina, the Brugia region, and the Dinaric Alps. And of these three regions, or four regions, mountain regions, it is the one with the most consistent documentary record through the Middle Byzantine, late Byzantine, and early Ottoman period, which means that it is the region where it is the most possible to perform a systematic comparison throughout this period, especially in Macedonia. So the time frame under consideration stretches from the early 10th to the late 15th century, and this periodization rests on several grounds. So first and foremost, the documentary evidence. Textual evidence on pastoralism in this region only appears in the 10th century as a result of the stabilization of Byzantine rule over the coastal areas of Macedonia and Thessaly, and then the conquest of the First Bulgarian Empire, and also the Christianization of the Slavic populations of the First Bulgarian Empire, which produced a series of texts, mostly hagiographical, providing a glimpse on social structures in the region. And we should also take into account the fragmentary nature of evidence. Since textual evidence on pastoral communities is very scattered throughout this region, both spatially and chronologically, often with gaps of several decades or even centuries, it is necessary to take a longue durée approach, since there are peaks and valleys in the documentary evidence. And so in order to gather a sufficient mass of evidence to propose any kind of wider conclusion, this long time frame has been chosen. So the sources are multifold and are, so this research is based on several key sets of textual evidence in Greek, medieval Slavic languages, and Ottoman Turkish. These include administrative documents, such as fiscal and chancery acts, contracts and judicial documents, all of which form the core body of sources, and they mainly come from monastic and ecclesiastical archives for Greek and Slavic languages, and from the same, as well as provincial and central archives for Ottoman Turkish. So in addition to this core body of texts, I also study historical narratives, either chronicles or narrative histories, which allow, unlike the administrative documents, a nearly continuous view of the period, even with, albeit with much lower resolution, of course, in terms of precision. And the sources also include letters, which provide access to the conventional representation of pastoral communities, as well as travel narratives, which starting in the 15th and 16th centuries, written by some travelers from Western Europe, such as Bertrand or others, provide some description of the social situation in a different way than the sources produced within the Balkans. So before jumping into a presentation of some first results, I would just like to mention some aspects of the historiography on the topic. So pastoral communities in the medieval Balkans have been the topic of historical research since the birth of history as an academic discipline in the Balkans, but they were long considered from the point of view of their ethno-national identity in the context of the creation of modern nation states, most notably in Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania. But after the Second World War, the renewal in economic and social history also concerned pastoral populations, considered more in the village, from village point of view and the point of view of wealthy landowners. In the field of Ottoman studies, pastoral communities have long been a significant topic due to their high prominence in Ottoman and Turkish cultural consciousness compared to the medieval Balkans. But due to this, of course, research has also mostly focused on Anatolia and on Turkic groups, such as the Yörüks in the Ottoman Balkans. So I will now present some first results. So these mostly concern pastoralism as a whole, more than and not only pastoral communities exclusively. So I would first like to mention the emergence of transhumance and the development of transhumance routes in the Balkans during this period. So indeed, long distance transhumance or seasonal pastoral mobility, one of the pillars of mobile pastoralism, does not seem to have always existed in this region, at least in Macedonia. And Byzantine documents allow us to trace its emergence and institutionalization between the 10th and the 14th century. So pastoralism was a key economic activity in southern Macedonia as early as the 9th century. But it appears to have been mainly practiced at the local level and centered around individual settlements. And so multiple acts, in the detail which I will not elaborate, consistently show that flocks only go from one village to the neighboring village or stay within the territory of one village. And so this picture where local owners graze their flocks on land belonging to their own settlement or its immediate neighbors corresponds very well to what we see in the farmer's law of the 8th century. So it seems that in the early Middle Byzantine period, in the 8th to early 10th century, in Thrace and Anatolia, small-scale local pastoralism seems to be the rule. And as we can see on the screen, several land sales from the 10th century stipulate that anyone could freely use fallow land, regardless of their owner. So this local system of pastoralism was predicated on the widespread availability of unused, abandoned, or fallow land within the territory of each settlement, owing to the low population density and low intensity of land use. However, starting in the 10th century, this situation of widespread pastoral lands and short distance mobility begins changing for three main reasons. Sorry, not yet. So the first reason is demographic growth, which incentivized the expansion of cultivated land leading to former pasture land located close to settlements to be converted into fields, vineyards, or olive orchards, for example, of course, which led to pushing out available pasture lands towards the margins of settlements and increasingly into lands which could not be turned into cultivated land, such as lowland wetlands or mountain prairies. Another reason is that wealthy individuals and institutional landowners started accumulating large flocks, requiring vast feeding ground, with which local dispersed pastures could no longer feed. For instance, in 1089, the very new monastery of Xenophon already had a flock numbering hundreds of cattle heads and over 2,000 goats and sheep. And so it was very small, a very new monastery, meaning that large monasteries such as Lavra or Iviron would have had much larger flocks at the time. And this probably also held for lay landowners. And finally, landowners, whether local or institutional landowners, also started appropriating the theoretically free fallow lands, which are exemplified in this quote. And so they started turning them into private pastures, which outside flock owners had to pay to access. And so the pastoral system started closing up and becoming more structured, becoming more institutionalized and stable. And so taking the monasteries of Mount Athos as an example of large landowners, we can see that starting in the 11th and 12th centuries, large landowners have a conscious strategy of acquiring estates with large pasture grounds. And so, as you can see in this map, which represents the acquisition of pasture lands by Athenite monasteries between the 9th and 12th century, we can see that, first of all, that these pasture lands are located in very specific places, notably along the coastline or in highland areas, and that they, over time, they seem to go further and further away from Mount Athos, which corresponds to, of course, the expansion of Athenite properties, but also to the development of long-distance pastoralism, which up to the 12th century, we can see cases of medium distance transhumance. For instance, you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the map, Kozuch and Ostiani. And so the sources evidence mobility between the mountains and the valley floor below over several tens of kilometers. So it is not a very long distance, but it is further than one settlement. The next step in the development of this Athenite pastoral system and the pastoral system of large landowners was the appearance of long-distance transhumance routes. And so this is where vlaks start to come into the picture, where pastoral communities start coming into the picture. And so a narrative derived from letters exchanged between Alexios I Komnenos and the patriarchs of his time mentions a community of 300 Vlach families, which grazed its livestock on Mount Athos around 1100. And so the size of this community, around 300 families, implies a very large flock, which would have required different seasonal pastures. This would have exceeded the capacity of Mount Athos. And so the description of this population suggests that they did rely on long-distance transhumance. And so this episode yields precious insight on the rise of long-distance transhumance. Since Athenite monasteries, by interacting with these pastoral communities, which were starting to emerge at this time, seem to have both plugged into and harnessed an emerging specialized pastoral system. And at the same time, in the 12th century, we can see Athenite monasteries such as Lavra starting to protect Vlach pastoralists outside of Mount Athos and trying to gain access to pastures for these pastoralists. So we can see the collaboration, the cooperation between these groups in order to secure access to pastoral lands. And so, due to the relative paucity of sources, absence of sources in the 12th and early 13th century, it is unclear when the monasteries of Mount Athos themselves, and not just the pastoral communities that they protected, started relying on long-distance transhumance. But by the 13th century, this is very clear. So on this map, which you can see on the screen, I represented the evolution of the transhumance routes of the monastery of Hilandar. So the triangular shapes show the extent of pastures owned by Hilandar around 1300. And in the 40 years which follow this, Hilandar acquires several seasonal pastures, both winter and summer pastures, very far apart in winter pastures in Halkidiki, in the peninsula of Cassandria, and summer pastures in the mountains around Melenikon, or Melnik today. So a distance of circa 150 kilometers. And we see a very deliberate strategy of acquiring these specialized pastures together, and also of acquiring exemptions on, for instance, tolls. So we see that the system is already well in place, and that monasteries wanted to acquire all steps of this process, all steps of this system. And so the case of Hilandar can be reproduced for many different monasteries, leading to this second map, which shows transhumance routes of Athenaic monasteries between 1250 and 1500 approximately, where you can see that compared to the very localized pastoral systems and mobility of the Middle Byzantine period, the mobility of monastic flocks has stretched to very significant distances in the late Byzantine and early Ottoman period. So, of course, this concerns large landowners and not specifically pastoral communities. But this provides, I think, an interesting snapshot of what was going on in the pastoral system more generally in Macedonia. So I will quickly touch upon another interesting phenomenon, which concerns pastoral toponyms and representations of space. So Balkan states were closely involved in the development of pastoralism and long-distance transhumance. And analyzing administrative documents yields interesting insight not only on pastoralism, but also on the way political authorities regarded it, regulated it, and recorded pastoralism. So the study of the language used, the types of vocabulary used by administrations is essential to understanding what can be known from the text and how these state administrations perceive the space, the territory under their authority. So based on the Greek language archives of Athenite and other monasteries in Macedonia, I was able to identify around 250 mentions of pastoral sites between the year 900 and 1600. Of these, 132 concern individual pastures. So these mentions can be classified into as one of three types, which you see here. The first type concerns specialized pastures with a seasonal qualification. The term used to describe the pasture says what it is for. So this, so you can see here, so here, this register mentions a winter pasture close to, in the region of Eridina, etc. Then the other type of mention concerns generic pastures. So you can hear Metochion takamena tismonist kolovu, Epirus iperhu, Hersis nomadies orinis. So this nomadiei tells us that there is pastoral land, but we can't really know how exactly it was used. And finally, the third type can be described as functional descriptions, which are very diverse, but which are descriptions of land specifying their use, which allow us to know they are used for a pastoral end, but no specific word is used. And usually it is a very long and very idiosyncratic description. So here you can see, for just one example, monon ivatopedini na voskunt arogatus oronton dokon. So here, just the most generic term topos is used, terrain. And we just know that the monks of Vatopedi would graze their horses on this parcel. And so if we did not have this description, we would not know that it was a pasture. And so when plotting the relative frequency of each type of mention over time in these Greek language sources, an interesting phenomenon appears. So as you can see on this graph, the relative share of each of these types of mentions changes very much over time. Of course, sample sizes change, which explains most notably this peak in the 14th century, which is not, in my opinion, non-representative. But for other periods, the trends do have a form of representativity. So we can see that until the end of the Middle Byzantine period, around 1200, references to pastures are predominantly generic or functional, reflecting, in my opinion, the continuing variability of the pastoral system and the fact that pastoral sites were relatively indeterminate and could change over time from one year to the next. However, the proportion of specialized terminology increases steadily over time before reaching a peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. And this is linked to, in my opinion, to the development of transhumant pastoralism, to the institutionalization of the system by the state, which started adopting new terms, such as we saw, himadion for winter pasture, or planina for summer pasture, a term which is of Slavic origin and which we can also find in Slavic sources. And so we can see that administrative practices followed and adapted to the changing nature of the pastoral system. However, we can see that in the Ottoman period, functional terminology takes over once again. And this is also interesting in a different way, since this evolution can only be seen in Greek language sources and not in Turkish language sources, in administrative sources. In these sources, a technical vocabulary to describe pastures, so kışlak for winter pastures, or yaylak for summer pastures, is used. It is only in the Greek language sources that the descriptions become much more ambiguous. And this, in my opinion, reflects the disappearance of the Byzantine administrative tradition, which led to the fading out of the vocabulary that it used. Since these terms, these technical terms, were no longer useful to landowners, they were phased out in favor, for instance, of Ottoman terms or vernacular terms. So this reminds us of the importance of analyzing the structure of the documents to understand just what we can say. Based purely on Greek language sources, we might conclude that the pastoral system became less specialized in the Ottoman period, but this is not the case. So that also underscores why it is important to compare with other language corpuses, with Slavic language documents and Ottoman Turkish documents. So I would like to quickly touch upon a methodological discussion and notably the question of analytical categories. Since I used in this presentation terms such as Lak, human, Yörük, etc. But these terms are highly ambiguous and highly problematic to use as such. Since these pastoral communities were mostly oral societies, geographically and symbolically peripheral to the monastic, urban, and political centers where the literate elites produced written texts, the surviving sources are etic. They're produced by outsiders rather than produced by insiders. So this means that all of these terms, all these labels come from the outside. So how the question is how to use them. There are two challenges. Since the written sources often present pastoralist communities and pastoralists either as a generic whole without any internal variation, simply as shepherds or mountain people, or as very diverse groups which appear fundamentally different from one another, such as Vlachs, Albanians, etc., which obfuscates, hides the fact that they might share a common way of life, common spaces, and common practices. Furthermore, this leads us to ignore that these labels can change from one source to the other, and one group might be described as one thing in one document and as another in another document. And it is in fact quite odd, or at least it is to be noted, that both scientific literature and the historical record classifies pastoral groups, that is, groups whose existence is determined by social and economic factors, chiefly by language and ethnicity, such as Vlach, such as Albanian, such as Cuman, which means that in the historical sources and contemporary literature, an economic reality is always reclassified in ethnic terms. And so this should be taken seriously, of course, which means that there does seem to be a difference created through this separate way of life, but it should not be taken at face value. And the ambiguity of these ethonyms is compounded by the historic variability in their meaning. And some categories, such as Vlach or Yurk, have historically oscillated between serving as economic, political, or ethnic labels, such as Vlach, which seems to have an ethnic meaning in the Middle Byzantine period or late Byzantine period, and which seems to have occupational meaning in the modern period, in the Ottoman period. So this begs the question of how to go beyond nominal essentialism and how to avoid generalizing a whole population. Since not all Vlachs would be pastoralists and not all pastoralists would be Vlachs, even if they're called as such. And furthermore, the internal coherence of these groups is anything but obvious. Since these sources always come from the outside, it's very hard to know whether the Vlachs or Cumans described have any sense of a shared identity. So these exonyms might be convenient political and social labels used by the majority, used by the political center to describe a social reality difficult for them to understand, or simply which they do not want to try to understand in its internal cohesion. Since this is often observed for imperial margins or highly diverse mountain areas. So in conclusion, since I've already run maybe 5 minutes late, I would like to say that none of these labels used in the documentary evidence can be employed at face value and must be considered in context. As of now, I do not have a definite answer. It's very much a work in progress, on which I'm working right now. But it does point that any study of these pastoral communities must take into account deeply political construction of these labels and identities in the pre-modern Balkans. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Guillaume. It was very, very interesting, fascinating, showing your current research, also very exciting. So we now enter the field of discussions. And I would like to ask if somebody has a question to our speaker. Is there a question to our speaker? If not for the moment, I will kick off the discussion. I would like to ask you, you mentioned, of course, and showed us the Ettonite monks and pastoralism and their, let's say, bond to pastoralist groups. And now my question would be, for what purpose are the Ettonite monasteries keeping and breeding, for example, sheep and goats? Since the usage or their usage from the viewpoint of Orthodox fasting rules and monastic life is not primarily needed by the monks themselves. So you know what I want to say. So the question would be, did you come across the economic factors which actually have any interest in buying Ettonite goods and Ettonite sheep, goats, and animals in general? So this would be my first question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question. It is indeed a very important question. So it would, so to answer the second part of the question, the documents I've seen do not seem to mention the actors who buy from the monks. However, the monks do mention that they ship some of their products to different places, most notably Thessaloniki, where they have warehouses, and Constantinople. And so based on this and comparison with what we know of other landowners, it seems that they're simply following the practice of large landowners, and they are simply diversifying their sources of income, and that they try to have both agricultural production, wheat, wine, and also pastoral goods, also wool, meat, milk, and cheese, etc. And it is part of, in this regard, I think Athenite monasteries behave like any other large landowner in the medieval Balkans and the Ottoman Balkans. It does not seem that there is a specificity, since we can see from, for instance, some concessions from Byzantine emperors or Serbian rulers, that they give exactly the same kind of pastures to Athenite monasteries and other aristocrats. So they're really considered in this regard on the same level.
Thank you very much. Is there another question for our speaker? Well, if not, then I have a second one. I'm sorry for keeping you busy alone at the moment. You mentioned a very interesting formulation in the beginning. You said the pastoralists are barbarians from the inside, if I'm correct. So it is fascinating that, as you said, I mean, especially in the sources from the 9th and 10th centuries, the pastoralists also appear as fierce and bellicose people who also attack political structures or noblemen, assassinating them. If I think about the Western Balkans, Samuel's state, and so on and so forth. So do you have, based on the sources which you have read, the impression that this picture is changing? Because in the end, you said it's a picture from the outside, meaning does the picture change from, let's say, the fierce bellicose pastoralism of the pastoralist of the 9th, 10th centuries to, let's say, a more economically accepted part of society in the 14th and 15th century, if you can say so? I mean, it depends on the sources.
So I do not think I can answer on really the facts, but in terms of representations, I would actually subscribe to what Panos Sophoulis writes on banditry in the medieval Balkans. I think this representation is very situational. It's very contextual. It derives more from the relationship between the political powers and these communities at any one given moment than what they're actually doing. It does seem that, for instance, the Albanians in John Cantacuzzinos, in some passages where they make peace or where they submit to him, they are described as perfectly ordinary citizens, ordinary subjects. And in others where they rebel, they are described as bloodthirsty and as treacherous. So it really does seem to be more of a political qualification. There might also be a degree of simply also prejudice from the urban centers, I think, and the urban elites towards these, from their perspective, marginal populations. But this political aspect does seem key, which also seems to to show how political this relationship is. It's not just economic, it's not just about income, it's also really about whether these populations submit and accept to enter the political system of these centers or not.
Are there any questions from your part? If not, then I will just ask another one. Sorry for keeping you busy now, but I wanted to ask you, you showed us very nicely the study of the language used, and then you described the specialized pastures, the generic ones, and so on and so forth. Do we have any valid description in the sources, and even being from the late period of the 15th century in the travel accounts and narratives, what a summer pasture looked like? And not in the sense, you know, what I want to say is, if it was characterized in many words by the travel narrative, in the sense, what do you encounter there from a landscape feature, meaning bushes, meadows, you know what I mean? So yeah, think about military handbooks of the 19th century, where it is exactly described when you say forest, what is a forest according to the military? You still have such military handbooks also in the Austrian army, where it is described to the soldiers, what is a small forest? What does a small forest look like? How many trees do stand there? You know what I mean? So do we have a, let's say, a very thorough description what the fauna and the flora looked like in such, let's say, summer or winter pastures?
Well, that's an absolutely excellent question, because it really goes back to the key problem, which is that these sources are very elusive and they say very little about space and leave very much almost everything to be guessed or to the imagination. So as to more recent descriptions of summer pastures, yes, there are some, I think, in travel narratives of the 18th and 19th centuries, or at least, well, yes, there are. They might not be extremely detailed, since that is rarely what interests them the most, but there are also ethnological investigations from the 19th century. So from our point of view, there are historical narratives, since the situation described has completely changed since then. But yes, for the modern contemporary periods, we do have some descriptions, but my sense from reading sources is that these labels cover quite different landscapes in reality. So I'll talk about winter pastures first, because that's where we have a bit more evidence. But first of all, it's noteworthy that the technical term for a winter pasture actually emerged much later than the one for, or at least was adopted much later than for summer pastures, only in the 13th century. So, and we can understand better why when we look at the kinds of landscapes, or at least what we can guess, since we have winter pastures in coastal areas, in swamps, in river valleys, sometimes close to a settlement, and we don't really know what the landscape looks like. So it seems that this, at least, is really a purely seasonal description. It does seem to be mostly humid areas, at least areas where there is water, of course, for the cattle, and where the temperatures are high enough in the winter for them. But there seems to be a very high diversity of landscapes, especially considering that when we do have a few delimitations of parcel delimitations, or at least when this delimitation seems to be close to a winter pasture, it really doesn't seem any different from from the regular agrarian landscape. Of course, there would probably have been some specificities, but doesn't seem, the writers don't distinguish these features. So as for summer pastures, to my knowledge, at least for Byzantine sources and Slavic sources, we do not have delimitation, so relatively detailed descriptions. Or when they do, or when these delimitations should include a summer pasture, it really doesn't say anything at all. It just says this mountain, that mountain, and it doesn't really describe the landscape. But in one document from the 12th century, it does seem that the summer pasture is mixed with forest. For instance, since we know that some users go to that summer pasture to graze their flocks, but others go there to cut wood. So this would seem to indicate that it was more a mixed woodland with some clearings rather than a very open prairie covering the whole mountaintop. But of course, this can't. Oh, sorry, my screen seems to have frozen. Please.
No, it's fine now. Yes, yes, yes.
Oh,
We can
okay.
hear you, yes.
Yes, sorry. But this is only one specific case, of course, so we can't generalize. We have many more mentions of summer pastures in the 14th century, and they are often located, they're really described as being in the mountains. So, okay, that we're sure of, but other than that, we can't really, as of now, I can't really say more. Perhaps in hagiographies, there might be some descriptions, at least imaginary descriptions, but I haven't looked into that kind of source yet.
Thank you very much indeed for this very, very interesting answer. Is there any question left? Any question? I'm just thinking of if I had one last, but I don't want to keep you if I do not come across it. Oh, well, perhaps just a small remark in the end. It's not a question, especially in Yugoslav literature. It was very much emphasized that the Vlachs were a social group. So basically, it was spoken about an interpretation that inclined that the designation Vlach in medieval sources would mean a social group comprising many ethnicities. But I have to admit that I did not come across any proof for that interpretation. So this is just a remark. It's not a question, which fits very well into your last points, which you mentioned in the end. Yes, I'm not sure if, I think we lost our speaker in this very moment. Well, this was perhaps a sign for me not to pose many questions. We will see if Guillaume will return. Just that we greet him farewell, we will see. Well, if this is not the case, then I will perhaps write him an email and thank him once again for his paper. I'm very grateful to you who attended. Hopefully, we will have our next lecture in the near future. We're always looking for very interesting subjects. I'm very grateful to Guillaume Bidot for presenting his research, and thank you for attending. So let us meet next time again at the third HistGeo lecture. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon and evening. Bye-bye. Ah, he is. He is. Okay, we will just say goodbye. Guillaume, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm really sorry. My
No,
it
no, no.
seems
It,
connection.
it's fine. It's fine. I just wanted to thank you once again for your wonderful lecture, and to wish you a very good evening. And thank you very much for all your effort. I hope that we will soon meet again in our third HistGeo lecture. Thank you very much, and we will stay in touch, Guillaume. Anyway, because of your PhD. So once again, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I was very happy talking with you today.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye bye. Bye bye.